I'm Isabella Martin and I'm a cross-disciplinary artist, which means that I use whatever mediums and processes come to mind. I work context specifically, which means that I go to a place and ask questions of it and see what happens and take the work from there. I found out about the project in October, and the reason I applied is that the chance to be directly into a landscape and making work in it, the actual studio being a part of the landscape, was really exciting to me. The brief of putting artists out into the landscape amongst people and being a very public thing was really appealing, because I'm really keen with my work to have an element that engages an audience and that invites participation and also in a sense shares ownership of the work. So having these studios felt like an opportunity to invite people into the project and in a sense collaborate with the place and the passers-by as well. Before I came into this residency, I had a set of questions that I wanted to explore, and beyond that, I didn't decide or determine anything that I was going to do here, because it was really important that, besides bringing these questions to ask of the landscape and of my experience in the landscape, I wanted all the work to come out of my experience of the landscape. So these questions were, I wanted to ask where the words are to speak the landscape into being. I wanted to explore how you could speak a landscape into being and explore the relationship between our environment and the language and words we use to articulate our experience of it. When I came here, I started by doing plenty of walking, and I camped nearby as a way to be further in the landscape and wake to the birds and fall asleep to the birds as well. Alongside that, there was plenty of looking and ways of changing my sight. It started with this feeling of wanting to look at my environment differently, and maybe through that could trigger different ways of speaking about it. Of course, linked to that, there are these structures. These structures became like listening posts, ways of pulling everything I could out of the landscape into them. Also as points of translation. I'd pull everything in and then work out how I could translate it. And it would be translating it into drawings, into writing, into letters, into objects. That was how I started, and then everything led from there. While I've been in residence, I've had this feeling of really testing what these structures can do, because it's a huge luxury, first of all, to have a studio which is directly into the fabric of the landscape, and secondly, to have a studio that turns around was just hugely exciting. That it's meant my experience of the landscape has been a constantly fluid one. So every day I've ended up making the same rotation in the studios. This one, where I work in mostly, I start facing east with the sun. Every hour or so I just inch it around to the west to track the feeling of the sun and the sun coming in. One theme that's run through the residency is wanting to be really aware of the fact that the earth is moving, that we are revolving, and wanting to really explore and interrogate the relationship between us and the sun. I use language as a means of navigation. At the beginning, I made work as a means of navigation. Walking was a process of my work at the beginning. Interrogating my surroundings by pulling out details, and I began to draw as a means of recording what I was seeing, but trying to do it in isolation. I collected a series of drawings which were at the views at the end of paths, and just those shapes, for instance. When I came back from a walk, I'd trace the route I'd taken on a map, and then that would be turned into a shape, for instance. So trying to use my interaction with the landscape as a way of generating material. The main thing, of course, was writing. I wrote as a way of recording my observations of being in the landscape, and then I wrote as a means of recording my encounters with people. But with the writing, I began to write letters. I wrote letters to a friend and collaborator, the American artist Mary Roethlisberger. We've written letters to each other throughout the residency. She's been based in America and I've been based here. We wanted to exchange places in some ways, try and communicate and articulate an experience of being in our respective places to such an extent that we could transport the other there. On my walks, and I've done a lot of solitary walking, as I walked past people, I began writing letters to them as a means of trying to share an experience of the landscape and also finding common ground. To my surprise, these letters have become quite intimate. I think that's been through an attempt to connect to passerby and to really understand how we see the landscape differently and ask them questions about where we've been. But in a way, these letters are more like dedicating these walks to the people I've passed on them, because they're never going to hear or read the letters. So every time I read them aloud, it feels like an act of dedication. In the way that a bench dedicates a view to someone, that's how these letters feel. It's been really interesting working in these studios adjacent to a science centre. There's this lovely thing about the science centre being a place where people are finding out. It's not just a place that teaches science, it's a place that gives people the tools to find and discover things out for themselves. I would love to make art that offers the same, that offers people an opportunity to find something out for themselves. I think being next to the science centre's really influenced what I want the work I make to achieve. With all my work, I really want to make it as public as possible. I like this idea of an artist being accountable to people. It's really exploring that relationship between how people respond to your work. And so having the opportunity to have these structures and talk to people and have people ask questions of the work and me ask questions back at them, having that exchange and interaction has given my work this feeling of being a conversation. And I think that's something that I'd really like to continue with my practice and explore in more depth and bring more to the surface. During the residency, I've had this feeling of collecting and gathering, pull it up on the walls and on the shelves, and now what's going to happen is I'm going to take everything that I've made and done, and I see that all as parts of a process. I really like seeing work that I make as just moments where an idea comes up above the surface. But it's all part of one continuum. There's no point at which the work stops or the ideas take final form. So everything that I've made here, from the flags to the drawings to the objects I've made, I'm going to take it all back into my studio. I'm quite excited to see what happens when I have that other distance from it. Now it's going to be a process of developing work from them. Several of the letters and words that I've spoken and talked and collected, I'm going to try and make sense of them in several different ways and see where they go. Intersperse them with the drawings and the objects I've made to look around me and try them out in different places as a way of extending the residency to not just explore this landscape, but if the experience of being here can give me a way of looking at a place. One thing I've done while I've been here is make a series of 8 flags. The intent with these was to take some of the text and offer it to the landscape in a sense. Also, make this kind of weather-dependent reading. I love the idea that through trying to read the words that are on these flags, it increases your awareness of what the wind's doing or such. Or you might be defeated by the weather, by your attempt to articulate something, which potentially is how I've been thinking about how words and places have this fluid and sort of slippery and unstable relationship. Part of this residency, as well as exploring and interrogating the present moment in this landscape, I've also been looking much, much further back, learning and researching about how these South Downs were formed. At one point I was reading that 60 million years ago this was a shallow sea, and there was something about the particularity of the word shallow that made that sea a real and present thing. That made me really want to connect those two times. How can we be aware of 60 million years ago and aware of right now? The flags that I've made have taken this, in a sense, have tried to explore this journey of trying to find water in this landscape as a cipher, as a handhold onto this distant past of it being an underwater sea landscape. The furthest line of horizon is always deep blue. The more I've been looking at the distant horizon and at the furthest point of perspective, that deep blue has turned into a sea. And the more I've thought about that as a sea, that seemed a way to connect then and 60 million years ago. So these flags, the text on them seeks to articulate that feeling of the land being a folded, fluid, shifting thing that is in a constant state of flux. Speaking where we are into being, the key to attempting to do this is to acknowledge words and the land they land on as equally fluid and each needing the other to exist. The main question and thought that I'm left with when I leave this residency and this landscape is really thinking and wanting to know what happens when we put what we see into words.